Hi, my name is Zach. Today we're going to be building an API or application programming interface, and we're going to be building it in JavaScript. Now, if you don't know JavaScript, that's okay. We're going to be going over it at a very low level, and I'm going to cover every line that we write. In addition to that, the completed code will be available in the description down below. Before we get into the actual coding, I want to go over a few concepts so that you better understand what we're actually going to be building. So first off, we're going to be building a simple API using JavaScript, Node, and Express. JavaScript is a programming language that's designed primarily to be used for web browser-based apps. And to prove this, you can actually run JavaScript right in your browser. So if you open up just a simple Google tab and press F12 on your keyboard, it brings up the console over here on the right. And if you clear this out, you can actually type JavaScript right into this. So I can define a variable and assign it a value. And now I can use this variable to do some sort of calculation. So if I want to add 3 to it, I can say variable plus equals or plus 3. And now it'll tell you that your variable has been incremented by 3. So plus equals says take my variable's current value and add this number to it. So we're taking 1 and we're adding 3 to get 4. So this is what JavaScript is used for. It's used to design web pages like Google and YouTube and whatever else. And you can often see the code of a web page right in this F12 elements browser. So the script here, this is pointing to a JavaScript file that defines what this web page does. So we'll be using JavaScript to do it. And what Node is a backend framework that allows you to use JavaScript, which is primarily a front-end language, to build a backend application. And Express is a library that we're going to import to make creating an API very, very simple. Now, what is an API, you might ask? Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface. Now, what this means is this application sits between 2 other applications as a sort of middleman and allows you to perform operations. So in the example down here at the bottom, we have a database that is connected to an API. Now, the only thing that can talk to this database to update our data is our API. What that means is anytime that someone wants to interact with our database, they have to do it through our API. So people will build web apps to interact with that data, or mobile applications that will communicate with our API, which will then perform the database operations. This adds an extra layer of security so you can authorize who's changing things in your database. It also offers a layer of protection because if your API gets hacked, that doesn't necessarily mean that your database is compromised. And it allows you to do other things as well. For example, an API doesn't have to be connected to a database. An API can be connected to another API. So this chain can go on forever. You can have one API that does nothing but talk to a bunch of other APIs. We usually call that a sort of API like service layer. So everything comes in through one API and that divvies up the work and calls the correct API to do that assignment. Now, for what we're going to be building, we're not going to have a database. We're not going to have another API. We're just going to have our one API, and we're going to talk to it with a web app and a web browser. Now, the way we're going to talk to our API is with REST methods. So REST is an acronym for Representational State Transfer. Now, this is basically an architectural style that provides methods for us to interact with our API. And these methods are get, put, post, patch, and delete. Now, each of these methods is basically another way you can call your API, and they're generally used for specific purposes. So a get is what web browsers use most of the time to get whatever they need to display on the screen for the user. Now, a put is something that other APIs or applications can use in order to create or overwrite data in an API. Now, a post can also be used to create or update an item in the API, but it might only be like a partial update, or maybe they don't use a put in their API and they only use post. That's fine. A patch can also be used to update an existing resource in an API. A patch request will generally fail if the resource doesn't exist yet. So then you would need to use a post or a put. And then a delete is used to remove an item from a resource or a database or an API. So if you have a user account, for example, on Facebook, and you want to delete your account, well, you would probably use a tool like the Facebook app to send a delete request to delete your account. Now, whether or not they actually do that is another question entirely. You see, this is not law by any stance. This is best practice. So in order to comply to REST principles, these are the general guidelines that you want to follow. Now, as you can see, there's a little ambiguity between put, post, and patch, and these can be done in different ways, and there's something called idempotency that factors in as well. But none of this is set in stone. If you want, you can actually build an API that uses a GET request to delete something in your database. Now, that's definitely not best practice and probably not something you want to do, but it's not against the rules. No one's going to enforce you to do this. You can build an API however you want, but in order for it to make sense to everyone and for new people to come and work on your code, you probably want to comply to these principles. But that's generally the broad concepts of what we'll be using today. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, if you don't have it already, what we need to do is actually install Node. This is going to allow JavaScript to run on a local machine instead of in a browser. So head on over to nodejs.org, link down below. Now, when you pull up this page, you're going to see a couple options. You have the current version and the LTS version. LTS stands for long-term support, and that's what we want for this. So go ahead and click this button, and it's going to start a download. Once this opens up, you'll need to go through the install process. Now you just need to click next through the prompts. Make sure you click I accept on the license agreement. Select the folder where you want to save Node.js. You don't need to actually check this box. This will install some additional software. We don't really need that. And then once you click install, it's going to go through the install process. Once this is done, go ahead and click finish. Now we need to install one more piece of software before we get started. So what we want to install is called Visual Studio Code. If you already have it installed, go ahead and skip the step. But Visual Studio Code is what we call an IDE, Integrated Development Environment. It's where we're actually going to be writing our code. So go ahead and head over to Google, just type VS Code, or head over to code.visualstudio.com in order to start the download. And once this pops up, just click the download button. This link will also be in the description down below. And once this boots up, we're going to go ahead and install it. When this pops up, go ahead and click yes or OK. Make sure you accept the license agreement, click next, check the box to add a desktop icon, click next, and install. Once this is done, go ahead and click finish, and we do want to start Visual Studio, so you might as well leave that checked. Go ahead and close out your browser, and Visual Studio should pop up. Once this comes up, you can close out the release notes, and on the welcome page, we will want to create a new project. So I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen. Now I'm going to go up to File, Open Folder. This is going to open up my projects folder. You can create a projects folder wherever you want. I'm going to go into my Node folder, and I'm going to create a new folder. I'm just going to call this Simple JS API. I'm going to use camel case, which is where you capitalize the first letter of every word after the first one. And then I'm going to select that folder. This is going to open up my new folder in Visual Studio Code. As you can see, there's no files in it. So we're going to start this off by opening the terminal. So there's a couple ways to do this. You can go to Terminal, New Terminal. You can also do Control-tilde on your keyboard, and it will open up your terminal down here at the bottom. Now, since we just installed Node, we have a couple of commands at our disposal. So we're going to use one of these now, and it's called npm init. So you're going to type npm November Papa Michael init, I-N-I-T, and this is going to ask you a couple questions about your project. So the first thing is, what do we want the package name to be? It defaults to the folder name, which is simple.js API. That's fine for this scenario, so I'm going to click enter. It's going to ask for the version number of the app we're going to build. 1 is fine. It's going to ask for a description of the app we're building. So I'm going to just say a simple REST-based API. It wants to know what the entry point is of our app. By default, it's index.js. That's fine for this as well. So I'm going to press enter. It wants to know what the test command is. We're not going to do unit tests for this. I'll do another video on that in a later date. So just click enter for this. And it wants to know the URL of your Git repository. So this is important because you do probably want to store your code in the GitHub. So you can reference it later. You can pull it down to other machines. You're going to have people help you. It also serves as a kind of portfolio for programmers. So let's go ahead and actually head over to GitHub and set up a new repo for this. So I've got github.com pulled up here, and what we need to do is actually, if you haven't already, create an account for this. And once you've created your account, we need to create a new repository. So there's a button up here in the top left that says new. I'm just going to click that, and it's going to ask what the name of the repository is. So I'm just going to call it simple.js API, a simple REST API, and I'm going to leave it as public. I'm going to go ahead and create the repository. And now this gives us a new repository. There's nothing in it yet. This is some instructions on how to put things in it, but we don't have to worry about that just yet. What we want is actually to grab this URL. So this https github .git line here. So copy this, go back to your terminal in VS Code, and you should just be able to paste this in here. We don't need any keywords. Author is going to be me, so put your own name in there. License doesn't matter. Is this okay? And then click yes. And so this is creating our package.json, and it creates this folder, this file for us, which just has some information about our app for Node. So the next thing we want to do is create our index file. So create a new file, and then just call it index.js. This should be the same name that we used in our setup for our main function. So this is basically the file it's going to look for when it tries to run. So go ahead and create that. And now we've got a blank index.js file here. We need to install Express so that we can get started. So go ahead and go back to your terminal and type npm install Express. Now this is going to go out on its own. It's going to grab the Express package and it's going to install it locally for your project. And now that's installed and we're able to use Express. And you'll see it created a package lock.json file, which kind of lists all of the dependencies and their dependencies and so on. So you'll see in our dependencies, we now have Express 4.17.1. Cool. Now at this point in the project, you're probably like, great, we're ready to start coding, but I don't know what to write here. I don't know how to create an API. So I'm going to do what I would do, show you what I would do if I didn't know how to use this package. So this is the Express npm package. So in order to figure out how to use it, we're going to look at the documentation for it. So if you go back to Google, you can type Express npm in your browser, and you'll see that expressjs.com comes up as one of the options. This is the official documentation for that package. So if we click on it, we'll see that it has some basic instructions here, basically what we already just did to create our repo, where we have our code. And then it says next we have hello world. So if you click this, it's going to go through how to create a hello world application using Express. And this is just a simple kind of Express endpoint that has one endpoint that you can use. So this is exactly what we're going to write. So I'll go over each of these lines in detail as we do them. For now, let's head on over back to Visual Studio Code. So the first thing we want to do is import Express into our file. Right now we have Express imported into our project, but it's not in our actual file yet. So we're going to declare a new variable with const, and we're going to call this variable Express. And we're going to set it equal to require, which is importing that Express library for us. So require, and then quotes, and we're going to type Express. Throw a semicolon at the end. So now we are importing Express into this file so that we can use it. So now we need to use that file. So we're going to declare a new variable, call it const app. And we're going to set this equal to Express. And this is a method call. So we're importing a method from the Express library, and then we're calling that method and declaring whatever it returns as app. Now we're going to declare another constant. This is the port that our app is going to run on. So we're going to set this equal to 3000. That's pretty standard for a local running application. Now, we get into kind of the good part of Express. You can now use this app we created and do an app.get, and this has a couple parameters. So you can give it a path. So this first argument is the path of how you're going to get to this URL or get this response, and the alternate or the second parameter it accepts is a request and a response. And I'm going to actually type these out: request and response. So request and response are what your browser actually sends behind the scenes to APIs as it communicates to them. So when you type in a URL in your browser, you're actually sending a GET request to an API. And that API is returning a response. And the response is the web page that you get back. So in this scenario, we're just going to do something super simple. And if you send me anything at this URL, we're going to do response.send, and we're just going to say hello world. Now, this may seem silly, but this is what we would often call something like a health endpoint. So this endpoint doesn't require any parameters, just requires that you call it, and it will send back a response. Now, it's only going to send that response back if the server is healthy, so your application is running. And if it doesn't send it, that means your application is not running. So even though this is technically a hello world endpoint, it could be functioning like a health check. But that's kind of getting into the weeds a bit. So I'm going to throw a semicolon on the end here. And the last thing we need to do in an Express app is the last line always needs to be an app.listen. This basically tells Express, hey, I've already given you all the instructions that I want. Now I want you to execute them and start listening for requests at these endpoints. So app.listen, and we're going to give it the port we defined earlier. So it's going to listen on port 3000. And then we need to give it a function. So this is actually what we call an arrow function or an anonymous function. It's an unnamed function in JavaScript. I'm not going to go too much into the details here, but I want you to know that this is functionally the same as writing a new function. So you could type function myfunc, and this is the parameters it would accept, and this is the body of code that it would execute, return nothing, right? So this is functionally the same as this. It's just a lot shorter, so you'll see it very often in code. So this up here is actually the same thing. This is a function that accepts a request and a response and returns response.send hello world. So this is the same as saying request, response, and then this. So these two things, this anonymous function inside of here is functionally the same as this actually defined function here. It just doesn't have a name, so you can't refer to it as my function, and you can't use it later on without copying the whole block of code. So in our anonymous function, we only want to do one thing, and that's just let the user know that the app is running. So we're going to console.log, and we're going to say simple API listening at http://localhost. And then you can provide it with your port number. So you could type 3000 there, you could type port in here, and when you put a comma here, you're actually going to be basically concatenating these two items. So it's going to say, hey, this is a string I want you to print onto the screen, and this is a variable and I want you to print that. Now there's another way to do this, which is what they use in the example, and you can actually use a different kind of quote. So if you use the tilde key, which is right next to the 1 key on your keyboard, you can use this instead as a quote, but instead of having to separate out your parameters like that, you can put a $sign and a curly brace and another curly brace here, and this will say, hey, use this port or use this variable, but insert it inside of this string. So go ahead and throw some semicolons on here and Control S to save. Now, believe it or not, your API is actually already ready to run. So what you can do is type node index.js. Now this is saying I want Node to pick up this file and run it, and this is the name of the file I want you to grab. So we're in the folder for Simple.js API already, as you can see right here. So it's saying in my current folder, find this index.js file and then run it. So if we click enter here, this should start our app. And as you can see, the first thing it says is simple API listening at localhost 3000. So our app is running. So now what we want to do is actually open up a browser, navigate to our application that we have running. So go to localhost:3000. And this prints out the text hello world. So our app is already running. It's already returning responses whenever it gets a request. And if you kill your app, so if you go down here and you press Control-C to turn off your application, and you go back to your browser and you hit refresh, you're not going to get hello world anymore. You're going to get a not found error, right? The site cannot be reached. So that is how a health check would work, right? You would call an endpoint, and if you receive a response and it's the response you expect, then the app is healthy. And if you don't receive a response, then it's not healthy. So we already actually have a running, working API with 11 lines of code. Now we're going to expand on this a little bit more. We're going to add some more endpoints, and we're going to use some more RESTful methods. So remember we talked about REST methods. This is a GET request, app.get. So you can do other methods just by saying app dot and then the method name, so app.post. So you can do other methods just by typing app and then dot the method name, so app.post, and we're just going to use the same root endpoint, so we're not going to put a path in here yet. And we're going to give it the same request response, declare it as a new anonymous function, and in here we're going to do response response.send, and we're just going to say success. Now, this doesn't do anything just yet, but it will. So it's complaining because I didn't put a comma in here. So make sure you have a comma separating your parameters. And so right now we have a new post endpoint that will accept data, but it doesn't actually do anything with that data just yet. So in order to support this, we're going to add another get API. So just take this block of code, Control C to copy it, and paste it here. And what we want to do is change this. So our hello world is going to become /health. It's going to become a health check. And instead of returning hello world, it's going to return healthy. And then we're going to do another endpoint. We're going to call it /logs. And it's going to return an item that we're going to call logs. So we'll do logs. We're going to do JSON.stringify logs. Now logs is going to be a variable that we don't have just yet. So let's go to the very top. Let's declare a new variable. And we're going to call it let logs. And this is equal to an array. Now it's going to be an array of strings. So here we're going to say response or result is equal to logs or no logs sent or saved. No logs saved. After thinking about this for an extra second here, go ahead and actually delete this logs equals empty bracket. Make sure it's just let log semicolon. This will default logs to undefined. So when we get down to this line here, result will be equal to undefined or no logs saved. So if we don't have any logs, if logs is undefined, we haven't put anything in it yet, then it will default to returning this string no logs saved. But if there is logs, then it will return logs instead. So we're going to change this to result. So now if we run our API, so Control S to save this and run our API, looks like I forgot a curly brace right here after our first get. So make sure you have a curly brace and a closing paren, and then make sure you have a semicolon at the end of that. And now if we run our API, node index.js, you'll see that it's running, and you can actually do control click to open up your endpoint. So when you open this up now, it says cannot get at blank slash, and that's fine because we changed it, right? It's no longer anything at that point, it's now at health. So if you go to /health, you'll see it says healthy. Now if we go to our logs endpoint, so /logs, which we've defined in our code right here with /logs, you'll see that it returns no log saved. That's because we haven't saved anything yet. So now we're going to get into our post command, and every time we post to this endpoint, we're going to add something to this log. Now in order to test our post, we actually need to download a new piece of software called Postman. So if you head on over to Google and you type in Postman, postman.com comes up. We actually want the download the app option. So go ahead and click download here, and I'll put this link in the description down below. It's postman.com/downloads. And then go ahead and click download, and we want to install this. So accept cookies, download for Windows 64-bit, because that's what I'm on. And this is going to open up in just a second. So this is installing Postman. And now this is going to ask you to sign in. It looks like you do have to create an account in order to do this. I do have one already, so I'm going to sign in with my account. But for you, go ahead and create a new account, and then we'll see what it looks like on the inside. Alright, once you're logged into Postman, it should look something like this. The one thing we only need in here is create new. So just click the new button. It should look like this, and just create a new request. So we're going to call this post to simple API. And I'm going to create a new collection for this. Simple API. And we'll just save it in there. So in my collections, we now have Simple API here. So in Simple API, what we want is actually to change this to a post. So in this drop-down list, you have a list of all of the methods that you can use over HTTP. So in our project, we're going to use post, and we're going to do localhost, so http://localhost, and it's at port 3000, and we left it at the blank root. So we're going to leave it at just / for this. And in the body, we want to change this to raw, and we want it to be text. It should be fine. And we're going to say this is a new log. So let's go back to our code here. Let's turn off our app with Control-C. And whenever we receive this post request, we're actually going to want to save something in the request that they gave us. So in order to actually gather information from the request body, we actually need to add something to our app. So if we go to the very top here, we need to call our express method and do app.use, and we need to use this express method. So this is a built-in method in Express that lets you get the body of a request. So we need to use express.json in our app.use, and this will allow us to access our data. So now in our app.post, make sure response is spelled correct, by the way. I believe I messed it up earlier. In our app.post, we can now access that variable with request.body. So this will actually create a new variable. We'll call it log. So const log equal to request.body. So what this means is we're going to destructure the log variable out of the request.body. So for this to work, we have to have a log in our body. So let's head back over to Postman real quick. And we want to change our body to a JSON object. So before, this looked a little bit like this. It was set to text over here. Now this won't work because it's not a JSON object. So we need to change this to JSON, and now we need to shape it like a JSON object. So we need to give it a curly brace at the beginning and the end. We need to give it a key, which we're going to call log. This is how we're getting this variable. And then we put our value in quotes. So now we have a JSON body with a log variable set to whatever we want to set the log to. So if we look at this, we're pulling this log variable out into our own variable, calling it log. Now that we have our log variable in the code, we need to figure out if our logs is blank. So up here we defined a variable called logs. If it's empty, we need to create a new array. So if logs.length equals 0, then we want to do some logic. Now this evaluates to basically if logs length is equal to 0. What we want to do is if not logs. So if a variable is set to anything other than undefined, 0, or false, it will evaluate to true. So since this is undefined at the start because we're not giving it a variable, this evaluates to false. So this says if logs is undefined, then do this block of code. So we'll throw a curly brace in here, and we want to set logs equal to an array containing our log. Now, if logs is not undefined, we want to do an else in here. We just want to add to that array. So logs.push our new log. So now this will add to our logs variable whenever we do a post to our endpoint, which we can see at our logs endpoint. So if we start this up, so go ahead and go to node index.js down here. If we start this up, we can now go to Postman and we can click the send button. And if you set it up so they're here at the same time, you can kind of see stuff happening. If you set up some logs for it, which I have already removed, so you don't see anything there. But this says success, right? So it went through this code, did all this, and it sent us success at the end. So we know that this added to our endpoint. So now if we go back to our browser and we go to our logs endpoint, we'll see that this says that this is a new log. So if we go back into our Postman, we can now put whatever we want in this log. So logging in from Chrome is our new log. If we send this and refresh our web page, we now have a second log in here. So now you've created a API with a working GET endpoint, two of them actually, and an API with a working POST endpoint that keeps track of whenever it receives a request and saves something in memory. Now if you turn off your app, you hit Control-C, and then you turn it back on, and you go back to that endpoint, you're going to see that this is gone, right? No logs saved. Now that's because we're storing those logs in memory, and when the app turns off, that memory gets dumped. So if you wanted to persist this in like a database, for example, you would have to then set up your API to talk to a database to store that data on a long-term scale, which I will do in the next video. Just as a side note, if you want to actually set up your repo to store it in GitHub, just go to your terminal, type git init. This is going to initialize an empty Git repository. You want to add a new folder over here, call it .gitignore. And in here, you want to type in node_modules because we don't want to post our modules to GitHub. There's a lot of files in here, and we don't want to save those on the web. Once you initialize your repo, what you want and created your ignore file, you want to do your first commit. So do git commit -am, and then just say first commit. Git add dot. This adds all of the files in your working directory to your Git repo. Press the up arrow to go back to git first commit, commit it again. Now you've added your files to your repo. Now you actually want to use your git remote add origin, and this is the URL that we saved earlier. So this should be, for me, it's https github.com/thrassosoft/simple.js API, which we saved in our package.json earlier. So it's just this part right here. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it down here, and click enter. So we've added our origin. Now we just need to type git push -u origin master. So this is saying push from my local machine, upload to the origin, which is the URL we just added, and the branch is the master branch. So branching strategies is a complex Git topic that we'll go into at a later date. But for now, we just want to push to the master branch. So if you click this, it's going to push your code up to the repo. So mine is actually giving me a 4.3 unable to access, permission denied. So let me take a look at that. Okay, looks like my permissions error was the fact that I was writing to my Thrassosoft repo from my personal GitHub account. So this should work this time. And there we go. You'll see that it pushed and uploaded to my repo. So if you now actually head over to GitHub and check the repo that you just made, you'll see that there's now a bunch of files in there. So you're good to go. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know down below. And I'll leave a link to the completed code in GitHub in the description down below.